The thing about horses on the American frontier was this. They were the most valuable animals a homesteader owned, and the most likely to die in winter. A good draft horse in the Dakota Territory in the mid-1880s cost between $80 and $120, which was more than some families spent building their entire cabin. A working team of 2 was the minimum required to break sod, haul timber, pull a wagon 30 miles to town and back, and drag firewood through drifts that reached the axle hubs by December. Lose your horses, and you lost your ability to work, to travel, to haul feed, to do anything beyond walk across a frozen prairie carrying whatever you could hold in your arms. And every winter, across the northern plains from the Montana line to the Minnesota border, horses died. They died of exposure. They died of pneumonia brought on by standing in wet cold for weeks without relief. They died of colic from drinking ice melt and eating frozen hay that sat in their stomachs like stones. They died standing in lean-to shelters with gaps in the planking and nothing between them and a north wind, but a few boards of unseasoned cottonwood nailed to posts that rattled in every gust. The ranchers who lost them said the same thing every April. Hard winter, nothing you could do. The horses that survived looked like sketches of the animals they had been in October, ribs showing through dull coats, heads hanging, hooves cracked from standing on frozen ground for 5 months straight. The ones that did not survive were dragged to the coulee and left for the coyotes, and by May you could count the winter's toll by the bones scattered along every creek bottom in the territory. Gunnar Hallstad, who had homesteaded a quarter section on a low, grassy hillside 15 miles south of Medora in the Dakota badlands, thought about those bones every spring. He thought about them because where he came from, in Trondheim province on the western coast of Norway, horses did not die in winter. Not because Norwegian winters were mild, they were not. Trondheim sees temperatures well below zero, heavy snow, winds off the fjords that cut through clothing like it is not there. Norwegian winters are as harsh as anything the Dakota plains can produce, and in some years harsher. But Norwegian horses did not die because Norwegian farmers did not leave them standing in lean-to shelters made of scrap lumber and hope. In Norway, the animals lived in the fjøs. And if you want to know what happened when a Norwegian immigrant built an underground fjøs in the Dakota badlands, and every rancher within 40 miles said he was building a grave for his own horses, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The fjøs is the traditional Norwegian animal house. It is not a barn in the American sense. It is not a wooden structure sitting on top of the ground, open to the wind on 2 sides, and heated by nothing but the body warmth of the animals trapped inside it. The fjøs is built into the earth, into a hillside, into a bank, into the ground itself. Stone walls, timber beams, a sod roof that grows grass in summer and holds snow in winter. The animals live below grade, surrounded on 3 or 4 sides by earth that maintains a stable temperature year-round, regardless of what the air above is doing. In Norway, this is not considered innovative. It is considered obvious. You do not leave animals above ground in a climate that regularly drops below zero for the same reason you do not leave water in an uncovered bucket during a freeze. The earth is warmer than the air. The earth is always warmer than the air. At 6 to 8 feet below the surface, the ground temperature in the northern plains holds steady between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, winter and summer, regardless of whether the air above is 90 in July or 40 below in January. The Earth is a thermal battery so massive and so stable that no weather event lasting less than several months can meaningfully change its temperature at depth. Every Norwegian farmer knew this. Every Norwegian farmer had known this for 500 years. And Gunnar Halstad, standing in the Dakota spring of 1886, looking at the carcass of his youngest mare, who had died in the lean-to during a late March ice storm, decided that the Americans could keep their above-ground barns and their dead horses and their shrugging acceptance of losses that did not have to happen. He was going to build a fjøs. Gunnar and Astrid Halstad had arrived in the Dakota Territory in the spring of 1884, part of a wave of Norwegian immigration that had been building since the 1860s. They had left Trondheim not because they were starving, but because the farm could not be divided again. Gunnar was the third son. The land went to the eldest. The second son had gone to sea. Gunnar went west, which in 1883 meant a ship from Bergen to New York, a train to Chicago, another train to Bismarck, and a wagon ride south into the badlands with everything they owned loaded on a borrowed cart pulled by a borrowed horse. The quarter section they claimed was good land by Dakota standards, which meant it had water. A shallow creek ran along the base of a low hill. Cottonwood trees lined the creek bottom, and the hill itself was a mix of clay and sandstone that Gunnar recognized immediately as good building material. The soil was deep enough to grow wheat. The grass was thick enough to cut for hay. The problem was not the land. The problem was the wind. The Dakota wind in winter does not blow. It pushes. It is a physical force, a wall of moving air that comes off the northern plains with nothing to stop it for 500 miles, carrying cold that drops the temperature 20 degrees in an hour and does not let up for days. The cabin they built in the summer of 1884 was tight and well made, peeled cottonwood logs with sod roof and a stone fireplace, and it kept them alive through 2 winters without serious difficulty. The horses were another matter. The lean-to shelter that Gunnar built for the horses was typical of the territory. 4 posts, 3 walls of rough planking, a sloped roof of cottonwood poles covered with hay. It faced south to catch whatever sun there was in January. It kept the rain off. It did almost nothing about the cold. The first winter, 1884 to 85, was moderate by Dakota standards. The horses came through thin but alive, surviving on hay and creek water that Gunnar broke the ice to reach every morning. The second winter was harder. A January storm dropped the temperature to 26 below zero and held it there for 9 days. The horses stood in the lean-to and shivered. They ate their hay with frost on their muzzles and drank water that was barely above freezing. Gunnar wrapped them in blankets that froze stiff by morning. Astrid heated rocks in the fireplace and carried them to the lean-to put near the horses' feet, a gesture so hopeless and so tender that Gunnar could not bring himself to tell her it made no measurable difference. They lost no horses that winter, but it was luck, not management. The third winter, the late March ice storm of 1886, killed the young mare. She was a 3-year-old that Gunnar had bought in Medora for $90, a price that represented 2 months of wages from his summer work on the railroad grading crew. She died of pneumonia, standing in the lean-to in an ice storm that coated her coat with a shell of frozen water and dropped the wind chill to something that no thermometer in the territory was designed to measure. She was dead when Gunnar found her at dawn, standing upright, frozen in place, her eyes still open. Astrid did not cry. She wrote $90 in the loss column of the ledger she kept on the kitchen shelf, a small leather-bound book where she tracked every cent that came in and every cent that went out with the precision of someone who understood that on the frontier, arithmetic, was survival. Gunnar looked at the dead mare, and then looked at the hillside behind the cabin, and then looked at the dead mare again. He saw the hill the way a Norwegian farmer sees a hill, which is to say he saw not a slope covered with grass, but a space that could be opened, hollowed, shaped, and filled with the one thing that no lean-to shelter could provide: warmth that did not depend on fire or luck or weather, the warmth of the earth. The argument with Astrid happened at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in April, while the ground was still frozen and the dead mare was still lying where she had fallen because the ground was too hard to bury her. Gunnar explained what he wanted to build: an underground stable dug into the hillside behind the cabin, stone walls, timber frame, sod roof, 5 stalls for 5 horses, which was the full complement of their working team now that the mare was gone and would need to be replaced. A ventilation shaft to remove the ammonia and moisture without losing the heat. A drainage gutter to manage water. A structure that would keep the horses at 40 to 50 degrees when the air outside was 40 below, using nothing but the temperature of the earth itself and the body heat of the animals. Astrid listened. She was not a woman who interrupted, a quality that people sometimes mistook for agreement when it was actually the silence of someone calculating. When Gunnar finished, she opened the ledger. She pointed to the column of numbers. We have $41 in savings. The spring seed wheat will cost $12. The replacement mare will cost $80 to $90, which we do not have. The cabin roof needs new sod before October. We need salt, flour, coffee, nails, and lamp oil, which will be $8 to $10 when we ride to Medora. After the seed wheat and the supplies, we will have roughly $20. You want to spend it on a hole in the ground for horses. Gunnar said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The stone is free. It is in the hillside. The timber is free. It is on the creek bottom. The sand is free. The labor is mine. The only cash cost is lime for the mortar and iron for the hardware. I estimate $23. We have 20 after the seed and supplies. 23 is more than 20. I will earn the difference on the grading crew in June. We will not have a replacement mare until autumn at the earliest. That is 4 horses in a 5-stall stable. We need the mare to work the full section. We need the stable to keep the mare alive." Astrid looked at him for a long time. She was doing arithmetic. Not just the dollars, but the larger calculation, the one that weighed the cost of building a stable against the cost of losing another $90 horse, against the cost of having no working team at all if a hard winter took 2 or 3 at once, against the cost of being 15 miles from town with no horses and no way to get there. She closed the ledger. Build it. But if it costs more than $23, you will explain to me where the extra money went, and I will decide whether it was worth it. The construction began in May, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig. Gunnar started by marking the entrance on the south face of the hillside, 30 yards upslope from the cabin. He chose the south face for the same reason Norwegian farmers had always chosen the south face: sun exposure in winter, protection from the north wind, natural drainage away from the entrance. The hillside at this point was a mix of compacted clay and sandstone, firm enough to hold a vertical cut but soft enough to work with a pick and shovel. Gunnar excavated horizontally into the hill, creating a passage 8 feet wide and 8 feet tall. He dug straight in for 45 feet, widening the space as he went until the interior chamber was 28 feet wide at its deepest point. The excavated material, a mix of clay and broken sandstone, he hauled by wheelbarrow to the cabin, where Astrid used some of it to patch the eroded sod roof and the rest to build up the garden beds. The shape of the finished excavation was roughly rectangular, 45 feet deep into the hillside by 28 feet wide, with an 8-foot ceiling. The total floor area was approximately 1,260 square feet, more than enough for 5 horse stalls, a central aisle, and hay storage along the back wall. The walls of the excavation were exposed earth and stone, stable in the clay but prone to crumbling where the sandstone layers were thin. Gunnar lined the walls with dry stacked fieldstone gathered from the creek bottom and the hillside itself, fitting each stone by hand without mortar on the lower courses, and using lime mortar on the upper courses where the earth pressure was greatest. The stone walls were 3 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet at the ceiling line. This was not decorative. 3 feet of stone against compacted clay would bear the lateral pressure of the hillside for decades without shifting. The roof was the critical structural element. Gunnar felled 12 cottonwood trees from the creek bottom, each 8 to 10 inches in diameter, and peeled and dried them for 3 weeks in the May sun. These became the roof beams, spanning the 28-foot width of the stable, spaced 2 feet apart, resting on the stone walls at each side. Over the beams he laid a deck of split cottonwood planks, tight-fitted and sealed with a layer of clay. Over the clay he laid cut sod, grass side up, 18 inches thick. The sod served 3 purposes: insulation, waterproofing, and camouflage. Within a season, the grass on the sod roof would grow into the grass of the hillside, and the stable would be invisible from the surface. The only visible evidence of its existence would be the stone-framed entrance on the south face and the ventilation shaft protruding from the top of the hill. The ventilation shaft was the piece that Gunnar spent the most time thinking about. In Norway, the fjøs ventilation was often crude, a gap in the gable end, or a hole in the sod roof covered with a wooden flap. This worked in Norway because Norwegian fjøs were typically smaller and often shared a wall with the farmhouse, which provided additional warmth and air circulation. In Dakota, where the stable was a standalone structure and the winters were drier and more extreme, Gunnar needed something more deliberate. He built a vertical shaft from the center of the stable ceiling straight up through the hillside to the surface, a distance of 12 feet from the stable ceiling to open air. The shaft was 14 inches in diameter, framed with split cottonwood and lined with flat stones mortared in place. At the top, above the surface, he built a small louvered cupola, 2 feet square with angled wooden slats on all 4 sides, capped with a peaked roof to keep out rain and snow. The cupola stood 3 feet above the grass of the hillside, the only structure visible from a distance. The principle was simple. Warm air rises. In a stable full of horses, the air is always warm relative to the outside. The body heat of a single horse at rest produces roughly 2,400 BTU per hour, equivalent to a small kerosene heater running continuously. 5 horses in an enclosed space produce 12,000 BTU per hour. That warm, moist, ammonia-laden air rises naturally through the shaft and exits through the louvered cupola. As it exits, it creates a pressure differential that draws fresh air in through the stable entrance, which faced south and was fitted with a heavy timber door that could be opened to various widths using iron pegs set in the stone frame. The incoming air, cold but fresh, entered at ground level, passed across the stable floor, was gradually warmed by the horses and the earth, and rose to the ceiling, where it continued out through the ventilation shaft. This is a thermosiphon, a ventilation system driven entirely by temperature differential and gravity, requiring no mechanical parts, no fuel, and no maintenance beyond keeping the cupola louvers clear of ice. The air exchange was gentle, continuous, and self-regulating. When the temperature difference between the stable interior and the outside air was greatest, in the deepest cold of January, the thermosyphon effect was strongest, pulling the most air through the system precisely when the ammonia concentration was most dangerous. When the temperature difference was small, in the moderate weather of autumn and spring, the airflow was gentler, which was appropriate because the ammonia production was lower and the need for ventilation was less urgent. The drainage was the last engineering challenge. Horses produce roughly 8 to 10 gallons of urine per day each. 5 horses produce 40 to 50 gallons daily. In an underground space with no natural drainage, this would create a swamp within a week and a health hazard within 2. Gunnar solved this by sloping the stable floor gently, a fall of 4 inches over the 45-foot length, from the back wall toward the entrance. Along the center of the floor, he dug a stone-lined gutter 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep, running the full length of the stable. The gutter exited through the south wall below the entrance door, emptying onto the hillside slope, where it drained naturally away from the structure. In winter, when the exit could freeze, Gunnar kept a small pile of heated stones near the gutter exit to prevent ice blockage. This was Astrid's idea. She had seen her mother do the same thing at the fjøs in Trondheim, a small practical detail that made the difference between a functioning system and a frozen one. The total cash expenditure was $22.50. Lime for mortar, $6. Iron hinges, 4 pairs for the stall gates and the main door, $8. Iron nails, 10 pounds, $3. Iron rings for the horse ties, 5 at 50 cents each, $2.50. Louvered cupola hardware, $2. Rope for stall partitions, $1. Everything else was free. The stone came from the hillside and the creek. The timber came from the cottonwood grove. The sand came from the creek bank. The sod came from the prairie. The labor was Gunnar's, 47 days from the first pick strike in May to the last stall post in July. Astrid recorded all of it. $22.50, she wrote in the ledger. Under budget by 50 cents. She did not add a comment about whether it was worth it. That column, she said, would be filled in by winter. The nearest neighbor, a cattle rancher named Warren Whitfield, who ran 800 head on a spread 4 miles to the east, visited the construction site on the 23rd day when the stone walls were up and the roof beams were going in. Whitfield was a Texan who had come north with the cattle boom and stayed because the grass was free and the government was far away. He understood cattle. He did not understand horses, which he considered necessary but replaceable, the way a farmer considers a plow necessary but does not build it a house. He looked at the excavation. He looked at the stone walls. He looked at the roof beams. He looked at Gunnar. You are building a palace for horses. It is not a palace. It is a stable. It is underground. Yes. Why? Because the earth is warm. The air is not. Whitfield removed his hat and ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he made when he was processing information that did not fit his existing understanding of the world. My barn is above ground. It has been above ground for 6 years. The horses are fine. You lost 2 horses last winter. Whitfield's jaw tightened. That was the cold snap in February. Nothing survives 40 below without shelter. Your barn is shelter. It was not enough shelter, because it is above ground. Above ground in 40 below is not shelter. It is a windbreak. There is a difference. Whitfield looked at the stone walls again. The stone was fitted tight, the mortar clean, the coursework as precise as a mason's. Gunnar had learned stonework from his father in Trondheim, where the fjøs walls had been built by the same family for 3 generations, each generation adding a course or replacing a stone, but never abandoning the fundamental principle that stone and earth together could hold warmth in a way that wood and air could not. "What about the air in there?" Whitfield asked. 5 horses in a sealed hole in the ground. The ammonia will blind them before Christmas." Gunnar pointed to the ventilation shaft, half-built, rising from the center of the ceiling. Warm air rises. It carries the ammonia up and out through the shaft. Fresh air comes in through the door. The air moves continuously without anyone doing anything. It is called a thermosiphon. Whitfield said nothing. He was not a man who liked learning new words, especially from immigrants. But he was a practical man, and he could see that the shaft made physical sense, even if the word was foreign. "How much did this cost you?" $22.50 in materials, plus 47 days of work. For horses. For 5 horses worth a total of $480. Whitfield did that arithmetic. Then he did it again. Then he put his hat back on and rode home without saying anything else, which was the closest Warren Whitfield ever came to admitting that someone else might be right. The horses were moved into the underground stable on September 15th, 1886. 4 horses, not 5. The young mare who had died in March had not yet been replaced. The stalls were bedded with a thick layer of cut prairie grass, which served as both cushion and insulation. Hay was stacked along the back wall, 9 tons of it, cut from the meadow in August, and hauled to the stable by sled. 9 tons was enough to feed 4 horses for 6 months at 20 pounds per day each, with a surplus for waste and spoilage. The grain, oats purchased from a farmer near Medora, was stored in wooden barrels along one wall, 200 pounds per horse for the winter, enough to supplement the hay during the hardest months when the horses needed extra fuel to maintain body temperature. The first overnight temperature reading was taken on September 20th, when the outside air dropped to 28 degrees, the first frost of autumn. Gunnar checked the stable temperature at dawn, 51 degrees. The earth was holding. The horses were calm, standing loose in their stalls, coats dry, breathing easy. The ammonia level was undetectable. The ventilation shaft was drawing a gentle but constant column of warm air up and out through the cupola. Gunnar could feel the movement when he held his hand under the shaft opening, a faint warm breeze rising steadily upward, carrying moisture and the sweet fermented smell of hay and horse, but no sharp bite of ammonia. By October, the pattern was established. Outside, temperatures fell into the teens and single digits at night, rising to the 20s and 30s during the day. Inside the stable, the temperature held between 48 and 53 degrees, regardless of the outside conditions. The earth surrounding the stable on 3 sides and above acted as a thermal buffer so massive that the daily fluctuations of the surface weather could not penetrate it. The horses stood in their stalls at 50 degrees while the wind outside pushed 20-degree air across the prairie at 30 miles an hour. They stood on dry ground, ate dry hay, drank water that was above freezing because the earth kept it above freezing, and their coats stayed dry because the ventilation system removed the moisture that would otherwise have condensed on them and frozen. Astrid began checking the temperature herself, twice daily, recording the readings in the ledger alongside the feed consumption and any observations about the horse's condition. She was not sentimental about the animals. She was precise. September 20th, exterior 28, stable 51. October 4th, exterior 19, stable 49. October 18th, exterior 12, stable 48. The numbers did not lie. The earth held. The winter of 1886 to 87 arrived in the Dakota Territory the way a door slams. A massive blizzard struck on November 13th, dropping 3 feet of snow and pushing temperatures to 15 below zero in less than 12 hours. The snow did not melt. It was followed by another storm on November 19th and another on November 26th. By December, the Dakota badlands were buried under a continuous snow cover that ranged from 2 feet on windswept flats to drifts of 15 feet in the coulees and hollows. The temperature did not rise above zero for the entire month of December. On Christmas Day, the mercury read 22 below zero at dawn and did not climb above 14 below by midday. This was the beginning of what the territory would remember as the Great Die-Up, the winter that killed a quarter of the livestock on the northern plains and ended the open-range cattle era in the Dakotas and Montana. Warren Whitfield's barn, a frame structure of rough-sawn lumber with battens over the cracks and a shingle roof, held a temperature of approximately 5 to 10 degrees above the exterior, which meant that when the outside air was 20 below, the barn interior was roughly 10 below to zero. The horses stood in their stalls with frost on their muzzles and ice forming in the water buckets faster than Whitfield could break it. He fed them double rations of hay, which helped produce body heat, but also produced more moisture and ammonia in the enclosed space. The barn stank. The horses coughed. 2 of his 6 horses developed respiratory symptoms by mid-December, a wet cough and labored breathing that Whitfield knew from experience would become pneumonia if the cold persisted. The cold persisted. Gunner's stable, 8 feet underground, registered 44 degrees on November the 13th, the day of the first blizzard. It dropped to 41 degrees by December 1st, as the accumulated cold of the surface slowly, very slowly, penetrated the earth above. It held at 41 degrees through the entire month of December. 41 degrees, not warm by any human standard, but for horses in stalls bedded with dry grass, eating dry hay, drinking water that was above freezing, breathing air that was continuously ventilated and free of ammonia. 41 degrees was not merely survivable, it was comfortable. The horses' coats stayed sleek and dry. Their eyes were clear. They ate their 20 pounds of hay per day and their 5 pounds of oats, and they stood in their stalls at 41 degrees, while the world above them was experiencing temperatures that were killing animals by the thousands. The body heat of 4 horses at rest, roughly 9,600 BTU per hour combined, was not enough to significantly raise the stable temperature above the ambient earth temperature. But it was enough to prevent it from falling below it. The horses and the earth existed in a thermal equilibrium, each supporting the other, the earth providing a baseline temperature that kept the horses alive, and the horses providing a metabolic supplement that kept the air comfortable. This is not a poetic description. It is physics. Thermal equilibrium in an enclosed underground space, occupied by large warm-blooded animals, is a measurable, predictable, engineerable outcome. Gunnar did not call it that. He called it the way things work in Norway. January brought the worst of it. On January 9th, 1887, the temperature at Gunnar's cabin thermometer read 38 below zero. The wind was from the northwest at a sustained 25 miles per hour, which put the wind chill at something beyond the capacity of 1880s instruments to measure. Modern calculations suggest an equivalent temperature of approximately 70 below zero. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Water thrown from a bucket freezes before it hits the ground. Horses standing in an above-ground barn at 10 degrees above exterior temperature were standing at 28 below zero. At 28 below, a horse's respiratory system begins to struggle. The airways constrict against the cold air. The moisture in the breath freezes in the nostrils and forms ice crystals that irritate the mucous membranes. The lungs labor against air that is dense and cold and painful to inhale. The horse burns calories at an enormous rate just to maintain core body temperature, converting feed to heat faster than the feed can be replaced, losing weight, losing strength, losing the margins that keep a large animal alive. Gunner's stable was 39 degrees. His horses were breathing air that was 39 degrees, moist but ventilated, free of ammonia because the thermosiphon was working at peak efficiency, driven by the massive temperature differential between the 39-degree stable interior and the 38 below exterior, a difference of 77 degrees that pulled air through the shaft with a steady, gentle force. The horses were calm. They were eating normally. They were not coughing, not shivering, not losing weight at a rate that would endanger them. They were standing on dry bedding in an underground room that was 67 degrees warmer than the surface of the earth above them. And they did not know that anything unusual was happening, because for them, nothing unusual was happening. They were warm. They were fed. They were dry. They were alive. It was during the January cold that Astrid's role became critical. Gunnar had ridden to Medora on January 6th, a 30-mile round trip that he expected to complete in 2 days. He had gone to buy lamp oil, salt, and the iron hinges he had ordered from the hardware store for the replacement to the cabin's broken front door. The blizzard of January 8th to 9th caught him in town. The roads closed. The drifts made travel impossible for a man on horseback. He was stranded in Medora for 11 days. Astrid managed the homestead alone. She managed the cabin. She managed the feed. She managed the stable. Every morning at dawn, she walked the 30 yards from the cabin to the stable entrance, wading through snow that was waist-deep in the drifts and knee-deep on the windswept flat. She opened the stable door. She entered a space that was 70 degrees warmer than the air she had just walked through. She broke the thin ice that had formed on the water buckets overnight. Water that was at 33 degrees, barely frozen, as opposed to the solid ice in every bucket above ground. She forked hay into the mangers, 5 forkfuls per horse, measured by habit rather than scale, but accurate to within a pound. She checked the drainage gutter, which was flowing freely, because the earth surrounding it kept the water above freezing. She checked the ventilation shaft, placing her hand under the opening to feel the steady upward pull of warm air. She checked the heated stones near the gutter exit, replacing them with freshly heated ones from the cabin fireplace every 2 days to prevent the external drain from freezing. She did this every morning and every evening for 11 days. She did it in a blizzard that killed 6 people in the territory, including a rancher's wife who froze to death walking between her cabin and her above-ground barn, a distance of 40 yards, in a whiteout that turned 40 yards into eternity. Astrid did not freeze because the stable was 30 yards away and downhill, and she had strung a rope from the cabin to the stable door on the first day of the storm, a precaution her mother had used in Trondheim, a rope line between the house and the fjøs that you followed with your hands when the snow was too thick to see through. Astrid followed that rope 14 times in 11 days, 7 mornings and 7 evenings, and every time she opened the stable door and stepped into the 39-degree warmth of the underground room and heard the horses nickering at the sound of her boots on the stone floor, she understood why Gunnar had built it. Not for the horses, for the family. Because the horses were the family's survival, the family's income, the family's ability to plow and plant and harvest and haul and travel and do every single thing that kept them alive on a quarter section 15 miles from the nearest town, in a territory that was trying to kill them 5 months out of every year. Protecting the horses was protecting the family. The fjøs was not a luxury. It was an insurance policy written in stone and mortar and earth, and the premium was $22.50. When Gunnar returned on January 17th, having waited 8 days for the roads to clear and then ridden 15 miles through drifts that reached his horse's chest, the first thing he did was walk to the stable. Astrid was already there, forking hay. The horses were standing calmly in their stalls. Their coats were smooth. Their eyes were bright. The temperature was 38 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 12 below. Gunnar said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "In Norway, the women manage the fjøs better than the men." Astrid did not look up from her work. That is because the women knew what the animals cost. February continued the cold. March brought one final blizzard, a 3-day storm that dropped temperatures to 29 below and deposited another 2 feet of snow on a landscape that was already buried. Then, slowly, the cold released. April arrived like a convalescent, weak and unsteady, the temperature rising above freezing for the first time in 5 months on April 3rd. The snow began to melt, the creeks ran with meltwater, and the counting began. Gunnar's 4 horses walked out of the underground stable on April 10th, 1887, into a world they had not seen since September. They were healthy. Their coats were thick and glossy with the particular shine that indicates adequate nutrition and low stress. They had lost no appreciable weight. Their hooves were sound, having stood on dry bedding all winter rather than frozen ground. Their lungs were clear. They were, by any measure, in better condition than they had been when they entered the stable 6 months earlier, because 6 months of steady feed and shelter and freedom from thermal stress had allowed them to gain the weight and strength that the previous winter's lean-to shelter had cost them. Warren Whitfield came by on April 14th. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse, which was thin and rough-coated and coughing, and he looked at Gunnar's 4 horses standing in the spring sun with their coats shining and their heads high. He had lost 3 of his 6 horses, one to pneumonia in January, one to colic in February. One had simply been found dead in the barn on a March morning, no visible cause. The accumulated stress of 5 months of cold and bad air and inadequate shelter having exhausted the animal's reserves until its heart stopped. 3 horses out of 6. A loss of approximately $300 in animals alone, not counting the lost working capacity, the delayed spring plowing, the inability to haul supplies until replacement horses could be found and purchased, which in the spring of 1887, when every rancher in the territory was trying to replace dead stock, meant paying premium prices for inferior animals. "How many did you lose?" Whitfield asked. "None." Whitfield sat on his thin, coughing horse for a long time. Then he said, "How much did that underground stable cost you?" $22.50. Whitfield did not ask anything else. He did not need to. The arithmetic was plain enough for a man who had just lost $300 worth of horses, to understand that $22.50 was the best investment in the history of the Dakota Territory. The valley's losses that winter were staggering. Of approximately 280 horses in the settlement and surrounding ranches, 127 died, nearly half. The cattle losses were worse. Warren Whitfield's herd of 800 went into the winter, and 490 came out. Across the northern plains, the Great Die-Up of 1886 to 87 killed an estimated 60% of the open-range cattle, and somewhere between 30 and 50% of the horses. It was the single worst livestock disaster in the history of the American frontier, and it ended an era of ranching that had operated on the assumption that animals could be left to fend for themselves through a northern winter if you gave them enough grass in the summer. That assumption died alongside the animals that winter. What did not die were Gunner's 4 horses. And because Gunners were the only fully healthy working team in a 15-mile radius that spring, they became the most valuable animals in the valley. Gunner hired them out for spring plowing at $3 per day per team, working them in rotation, 2 horses out and 2 resting. In the 6 weeks between the spring thaw and the beginning of his own planting season, the horses earned $84 in hire fees. $84. The stable had cost $22.50 to build. The higher income alone paid for the stable 3 times over in 6 weeks, and that did not count the $480 worth of horses that were still alive. It did not count the plowing that Gunner's own horses did on his own land, which went in on time because the horses were strong, which meant the crop was planted early, which meant the harvest was full, which meant the family had flour and income when half the valley was scrambling to replant on late-season schedules with borrowed horses that were weak and slow and cost twice what they should have. Astrid recorded all of this. In the ledger on the kitchen shelf, in her small, precise handwriting, she filled in the column she had left empty the previous summer. The column marked worth it. The entry read, "Underground stable construction, $22.50, 47 days labor. Horses survived 4 of 4. Valley losses, 127 of 280. Spring hire income, $84. She added 1 line below the numbers, the only editorial comment in the entire ledger, a book otherwise devoted exclusively to figures. She wrote, "You cannot calculate the return on animals that are alive against animals that are dead. The margin is infinite." Gunner built 3 more underground stables over the next 5 years. One for Whitfield, who paid him $40 for the labor and never lost another horse to cold. One for a rancher named Amos Pratt, who had lost his entire team of 6 and had to start over with yearlings that were too young to work. One for a family named Doan, whose patriarch Silas had sworn for years that horses did not need what he called coddling, and who changed his mind when his best mare dropped dead in the barn on a February night that hit 33 below. Each stable was different in detail, but identical in principle. Underground, stone walls, timber frame, sod roof, thermosiphon ventilation, drainage gutter, earth as insulation. As the earth as the heater, not coal, not wood, not fire of any kind, just the steady, patient, inexhaustible warmth of the ground at depth, supplemented by the body heat of the animals it was built to protect. By 1892, there were 7 underground stables in the valley. Horse losses in the winters of 1888 through 1892 among those 7 homesteads were 0. Not 1 horse. Not 1 animal of any kind, because some of the stables were expanded to include cattle stalls and sheep pens. The technique worked for the same reason it had worked in Norway for 500 years. The physics does not change. The earth temperature at 8 feet is 50 degrees in December in Dakota, and 50 degrees in December in Trondheim, and 50 degrees in December anywhere on the northern plains of any continent where the frost line is 6 feet, and the ground below it has been absorbing solar heat since the last ice age. Gunnar's original stable lasted until 1931, 45 years after he dug the first pick stroke into the hillside. The roof beams, protected from moisture by the sod layer above and from rot by the dry, cool air below, were as sound as the day they were set. The stone walls had not shifted. The ventilation shaft still drew air. The drainage gutter still flowed. When the property changed hands in 1931, the new owner used the stable for storage rather than horses because by then tractors were replacing draft teams and the horses were gone from the valley. But the stable remained, carved into the hillside, invisible from the surface, except for the small louvered cupola, standing alone in the grass like a monument to something nobody remembered. Gunnar carved a phrase into the stone lintel above the stable entrance the day the first horses were moved in. He carved it with a mason's chisel in letters 2 inches tall, the same way his father had carved the lintel of the fjøs in Trondheim. The phrase was in Norwegian. It read, "Got deer, got hus, good animals, good shelter." It was still legible in 1931. It may still be legible now if anyone has gone looking for a stone door frame in a hillside 15 miles south of Medora, in a landscape that has forgotten almost everything about the people who built on it, except the things they carved in stone. Astrid's ledger survived longer than the stable. It passed to their daughter, who passed it to her daughter, who donated it to the State Historical Society in 1974. The entry for the winter of 1886 to 87 is on page 43. The numbers are exact. The ink has not faded. The final line, the one editorial comment Astrid allowed herself in an entire book of figures, is still clear. You cannot calculate the return on animals that are alive against animals that are dead. The margin is infinite. No myths, no miracles. Just earth, stone, and warm horses standing in 50 degrees while the world above them froze.